I can always tell when April is around the corner. The reason, because all of the home and garden stores, the Home Depots and the Walmarts, they kind of section off a good portion of their parking lot, and they bring out the racks, all the different plants. They are anticipating pretty soon the customers coming in their grass-stained sneakers. They get the crab-a-side and put in the garden. Or maybe they're getting ready to get their seed packets. You know how you have that little carousel that rotates around, get your seed packets? Or maybe ordering mulch. This is that time of year when those home and garden stores really begin to kind of expand dramatically as people are getting ready. I think all of us, as the days grow longer, as it grows a little warmer, that we're pretty eager, aren't we, to kind of get outside, get out into our gardens, get our lawnmowers ready to fire up. I know I, for one, have been busy kind of getting some new shrubs for the front of my house. While my son was home at the end of last summer, I got him out with a shovel that he broke a couple times as he is digging out all my old shrubbery. And I was just waiting for spring to come to be able to put in some kind of new shrubs out front. But I have to admit, my horticulture skills are pretty limited. Limited to like digging a hole to plant a tree. I'm pretty good. I have lots of trees. Okay, I'm good at that. I can put in grass seed. I've got that covered. I can put in shrubs. I'm okay there. But bringing goodness out of a garden, whether that's flowers or vegetables, I really don't have quite that green thumb. But I know there are many of you who have a great passion and gifts in making goodness come out of your gardens. I know many of you. We have several master gardeners who I'd like to kind of tap in for information. One of the great gardeners in our congregation is Paul Davidson. Paul sings in our chancel choir at 11 o'clock. Paul grew up in Mineral City, Ohio, on a farm with his parents. And it was his mother, Marjorie, that really kind of helped nurture that green thumb in Paul's life, found a kind of connection to his roots in gardening. And that's what he does. And so I thought, in light of what I was going to kind of be preaching on today, about how we repair and restore a garden, that maybe I should ask Paul about what he does to help make goodness come out of his garden. Let's hear what Paul has to say.
We moved to this property in 1968. We've been here ever since. And I remember I walked by our little house here and I didn't even want to go in. I went to the back and there was no garden there, but I could see a garden being there. And I just fell in love with this little place. Some of the things I do to prepare my garden, I even start late in the fall. Basically, tilling in dead vegetation plus bulk compost. And then when that's all in the ground and worked into the soil, I'll take pellets of lime. I'll sprinkle that lime or broadcast that all over the garden. It's such a nice, loose, fertile soil, and it's so rich in nutrients. Just like when we're healthy and we come in contact with a illness, sometimes we don't even get it because we are healthy. The same, I think, is true of plants. Another thing that can really put stress on plants, and I think as much as anything, are weeds. Weeds can just choke a plant. And just like we are choked and can't seem to overcome, a plant sometimes will have a nice garden that starts out and then all of a sudden the weeds take over. If those weeds aren't removed it just completely chokes out the plant, and it can't flourish or it can't produce. I think all plants will produce something, but it won't be the quality. I guess it's my golf, I would say, too. It's my relaxation and recreation. I set a chair and I take a hoe and pull out all the weeds and put those weeds in a bucket, so I know those weeds are never going to grow in the garden again. I really discovered a passion for gardening after my father passed away. And he was pretty young when he died of cancer. And after that, my mom stayed on the farm for about 4 or 5 years, and we gardened together. And it was such a bonding type thing, and also a nurturing thing for us. It was a healing, I guess is the right word, that I think of as we work together. The very first summer my mom is there, and she's about 70 years old, and there's never been a garden on this place ever. And the next thing you know, this 70-year-old lady is out there with a rototiller tilling up the garden. And you can imagine what the neighbors were thinking. Even when Mom wasn't able to walk, I would drive the car back around the garden, and she'd go, "Oh, Paul, these are the nicest potatoes I've ever seen," or "This is the nicest." Well, it wasn't. She probably could have topped it, but it was just that we had this love affair with gardening, and we would sit on her porch so many times. And I'm kind of getting emotional here, but shelling beans together. And my mom had lost her sight, and I'd open up the bean pod, and she didn't really know it, or she didn't act like she knew it. And I'd put those in her pans, and she would then pull out the 4 or 5 lima beans. And we'd talk about the farm and the good memories. And boy, were they special times. So it was a wonderful time just to be together with my mother.
Ask Paul, really, what are those ingredients about what makes a good garden? How do you bring goodness out of it? And he talked about that soil, about how you prepare that soil, even in the fall. You mix in those leaves, and you throw on the lime, and work it all in to get it nice and loose. But then he really wanted to bring out that sense that even after the garden comes in, that there are weeds that will choke off that plant. And he sent a lot of pictures. That we included some in the video. Paul working out in his garden. The one we didn't include was there he was with his granddaughter. His granddaughter was right next to him, and he was in his kind of bib overalls. He's all kind of decked out with his little sun hat and digging out in the garden. His little granddaughter is right there with him. And I saw that picture that Paul sent, and at about that same time, I was looking and reading an article about the cleanup efforts over in Japan after the tsunami that hit. It's been 5 years ago this month. And so there was this report about the efforts taking to kind of help restore and repair the land in Japan that had been devastated by this earthquake. Thousands of people died. That we had so much destruction. But perhaps the most challenging part of that tsunami was regarding the Fukushima nuclear plant. And maybe you'll recall that as a result of the flooding and other kind of things, that nuclear core melted down and released that toxicity, that radioactive cloud, that they are really, even 5 years later, just starting to just kind of make a dent in. The report showed these images, very graphic images, of the land around the Fukushima plant for miles, that they have stripped off the topsoil. They have hazmat workers in full suits, And they're really taking this soil, this topsoil, and placing it in these big plastic bags, huge bags, kind of draped off. There are now 9 million plastic bags, huge. I mean, about the size of like a row of these pews, that are how big these bags are. 9 million of them stacked up in Japan. They're not even quite sure of what to do with it because of its radioactivity. And meanwhile, what you have is this kind of surrounding countryside. It almost looks like the far side of Mars because there's no vegetation, there's no life, and you have hazmat workers out in full suits stripping the topsoil away. And I saw these pictures from Japan and contrasted that to the goodness of Paul Davidson's garden. And that image was striking to me, kind of standing them side by side. And I thought in many ways, it's an image of really the toxicity and the brokenness that is all around our lives. Well, we do live in some really kind of polluted soil, don't we? We live in a world which gets choked off by so many weeds. Whether that might be bombs in Brussels, maybe terror in Turkey, starvation in the Sudan, crime in Chicago. You have that sense of all this brokenness, and many of that takes place much closer to home. There are brothers who betray brothers. You have families that are feuding. You have adults addicted. Children gripped in chaos. And the list goes on and on. And as we live in this world, we often feel like all the goodness can get sucked out and stripped to the point where there's nothing really vibrant and active flowing. And Christians, as we gather in churches around the world, we stand up and make a proclamation. We state that, God is the creator. He created this world. And we also claim that this creation is good. And I'm sure there are people who look at that affirmation that God is the creator, that the creation is good, and they begin to wonder, are those Christians smoking something that you find in a garden? Thank you very much. I mean, are they just kind of blind to the reality of the conditions of life? I mean, there is so much toxicity and sin and brokenness, and Christians all over, they get up and they say the same thing, that the end is not death, the end is life. Christians get up and sit there and make a proclamation that the worst thing is never the last thing. Christians proudly stand up and say that that in this journey of life that we are on the winning side. That because of the events that took place in a garden on an Easter morning, that because Jesus emerged from the tomb, that really the goodness of God has begun to help restore a garden that had been cursed by human brokenness, human sin. It is our rebellion. It is our disobedience. It's our selfishness which creates so much of this toxicity. It's when we sit there and we have religious hatred, we have racial hatred, and we build up so much toxicity that really can honestly poison the gardens all around us. And Christians say that that God has come to a garden, come to restore life and to offer hope. And that there's really a reclamation project going on. That God really invites us to participate in helping bring goodness back to the gardens by where we all operate. Now, earlier, Barb read to us from John the account of that very first Easter morning when this woman came to the tomb. We read a little bit earlier about how that tomb was found in a garden. And I want to pick up beginning in verse 11 from where Barbara left off. Mary stood weeping outside the tomb, and as she wept, she bent over and looked into the tomb. She saw two angels in white sitting where the body of Jesus had been lying, one at the head, the other at the feet. They said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping?" And she said to them, "They have taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have laid him." And when she had said this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, but she did not know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you looking for?" Supposing him to be the gardener. Hang with that image. She said to him, "Sir, if you carried him away, tell me where they have laid him, and I will take him away." Jesus said to her, "Mary." She turned and said to him in Hebrew, "Rabboni," which means teacher. Jesus said to her, "Do not hold on to me, because I have not yet ascended to my Father. But go to my brothers and say to them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and to your God." Mary Magdalene went out and announced to the disciples, "I have seen the Lord." And she told them what he had said these things to her. This is God's word and for God's people. Now, the things that I want to kind of bring out in this account of the Easter morning is that these women had come early in the morning to the tomb. And we read in chapter 19 that Jesus had been laid in a tomb that was in a garden. The Greek word there is kypos. We read in 18, the chapter before, that it was in a garden where Jesus was arrested and turned over to the authorities. And now in chapter 20, we get this sense that Jesus appears and Mary supposes him to be a gardener. Now, please note that John is the only gospel, the only account where any of this garden is mentioned at all. The others don't say anything about a garden. You know, we sing that song, "I come to the garden alone where the dew is still in the road." That's only based on John. The others have no reference. Why does John include this detail about a garden? You know, for the last 7 weeks, we've been studying John. And as we've been studying the Gospel of John, I've made that observation that in John's Gospel, there's always more than what meets the eye. There's a great deal of symbolism, a great deal of meaning. For instance, in John's Gospel, I started 7 weeks ago, and said John's Gospel starts this way: in the beginning. Where is that an echo of? It's an echo of the Genesis account. In the beginning, God created. And we see that when God created humanity, he placed them where? In a garden. We call it Eden, right? Garden of Eden. And now, in John's Gospel, at the climax of his story, as Jesus is resurrected, who does Mary suppose him to be? A gardener. I mean, John is very deliberate that what happened in that first garden, when humans rebelled, when humans disobeyed, when humans sinned, that the garden was cursed. But now, in this other garden, God's great restoration process is beginning. That really, the curse has been broken. The backbone of death, the one human great mystery, has been recovered because of the resurrection of Jesus. And that's a process, a reclamation, where God is wanting to encourage all of us to be a part of repairing the gardens that we all encounter. And certainly, we struggle with the brokenness of our world, and we may all be touched by its devastating impact. The weeds that want to choke us out, the addictions that grab our soul, we all have that challenge. But I'm telling you, friends, that our God has come into our existence, has lived amongst our pollution that we humans have created, and lived amongst us, went to the cross for us, and that even taking that last breath of it is finished, it is accomplished. And now emerging from that through the power of the Creator, that this new garden project has begun. And then that's that part where we are all engaged within us, to be invited to be a part of helping bring goodness out of our own sections of the gardens where we have been planted. Now, in light of this news of Easter, you generally have one of three responses. I mean, some of you here today, I get it. Your parents have drug you here. Your spouse has drug you here. You're about the last place you want to be today is here. But there's kind of ham at the end of the tunnel, and so that's why you're hanging, okay? I get that. The kids are squirming. They just want to get the chocolate bunnies. I understand all that. In light of this resurrection story of the restored garden, you generally have one of three responses. Well, the first response is, frankly, it doesn't really matter in my life. Life is about trying to get as much as you can, kind of sucking out the gusto, and that at the end, when you take that last breath, that like Porky Pig comes out onto the scene and says, that's all, folks. You live, you breathe, you die. That's it. And certainly that can be a choice we can embrace, a very fatalistic kind of vision of how we are to endure life. That can be a choice. You can also have another choice, I think, and that is you can be a fan of Easter, not a fatalist, but a fan. You like Easter. You come out on Easter. You get dressed up in your nice get-up. You like the visions of new earth or new life coming out of the earth. You love seeing the lilies, hearing the marvelous, marvelous music we have here. And if something comes up on your Facebook post, you like Easter. You're a fan of Easter. But at the end of the day, it really doesn't make any impact in your life. Frankly, I'm a fan of the Cleveland Browns. Being a fan of the Cleveland Browns really doesn't alter my life, other than makes me a little miserable on most Sunday afternoons. Nowhere in our Bible does God, through Jesus Christ, call us to be his fans. He doesn't say, like me on Facebook. No. Jesus calls us to follow in a path of generosity, a path of forgiveness, a path of hope. That's really the call of Jesus. Not just to be a fan, but to indeed be a follower. And I get that. To kind of follow Jesus is not easy. To forgive your enemies, to be generous to those in need, to sit there and to pray for those who persecute you. I get that. This is all hard stuff to follow on that path. But one of the news I want to share with you is we don't have to do it on our own. Because in our limitations, in the midst of our own toxicity, we would not be able to accomplish that on our own account. But what we have, the news of Easter, is that Jesus comes amongst those fractured, kind of dispirited disciples, and we have later on in chapter 20 about how Jesus appears to them and he breathes onto them the Holy Spirit. Again, you hear the echo of Genesis? You know how God breathed into humanity his breath and brought forth life? Now Jesus, here at the end, at the climax of his story, he appears to his disciples, he breathes unto them, and he says, as the Father has sent me, so I send you. I give you this power to help be a part of the restoration of the garden where we find ourselves. And God knows there are a lot of weeds out there. God knows there's a great deal of radioactivity and toxicity. And the times when you feel discouraged that you can never make it, that God says, I will be with you. And here's the thing, and this is the best news, is that this offer of eternal life, it's not just pie in the sky and the sweet by and by when you take your last breath and you get to cash in your Christianity insurance policy. No. It isn't anything about that. John didn't say you kind of come to get pie in the sky and the sweet by and by. He says you have come to have life and have it abundantly right here, right now. That's the promise of Easter. It's not just about when we take that last breath and are received into God's presence. It's so much more than that. And John's very clear. I've written these things. Why? So that you could believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you could have life in his name. And that life begins right now. Today. At this very moment, if you choose to believe, and then you choose to follow that path. And so, as this morning began, I get here early every Sunday morning. But as I was here before 6 o'clock, I went up and down all of these pews, and I kind of visualized, although you're kind of in different places than normal, but I kind of visualized all of you out there. And I kind of made a prayer. My prayer is that you would leave this place not just merely in a good mood about the marvelous music that I know you've heard. I hope that you leave this place not just kind of in a good feeling about how sap arises in the spring and new life emerges from the plants. I hope that instead you really leave with a different image. I hope as you leave this place, you grab on to the idea of a 72-year-old woman holding onto a rototiller, digging up a garden so that she could produce goodness from it. I hope that all of us will embrace that same kind of conviction as we leave here today, to be able to bring goodness out. That image of Marjorie Davidson, 92, blind, oxygen tank, chucking lima beans. Why? Because you see, my friends, she lived her life, not just for the sweet by and by. She lived it for now, for here, for God's eternity, helping to help reclaim the garden where she had been placed, to bring goodness from that garden. The offer is out there for all of us. As you pass all those lawn and garden stores, you begin to think about getting out into your own dirt and helping put in the flowers or planting your vegetables. My encouragement to you is, will we also get dirty in the work of God's reclamation project, that living out the life of Jesus to heal, to restore, to offer hope. That challenge is for you. That challenge is for me. Let's pray. Almighty and holy God, thank you for this Easter. Thank you for good news that the end is not death, the end is life. Thank you for that great news, that the worst thing is never the last thing. We thank you for the news that in this journey of life, we were on the winning side. Now help us, not just to be a fan, not just to be a fatalist, but to follow you, to get our hands dirty in the work you have called us to live in the gardens of our life. We ask these things in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.